morning, everybody. Yeah, the word expert, we've got to be very careful using it. But anyway, I think I know enough about microscopes. So Kevin mentioned Dr. James Phillips, Jimmy Phillips, as you guys know him. He's one of our clients, and maybe just tell you what our company does. So we do laboratory and scientific equipment, and the area of interest which we're going to discuss today is microscopes. We do, those who don't know, Jimmy Phillips did all the asbestos related illnesses for the National Center for Occupational Health. And there they use mainly electron microscopes. What we're going to talk today is let's say the step before that, which is the optical microscopes. So really microscopy is, let's say, divided into two areas. Your optical microscopy, which is, let's say, from 0 times, or I should say 1 times magnification, up to roughly 1,000 times. And then beyond that, the resolution becomes an issue. You can push it higher than that, but that's really where you get into electron microscopy. And electron microscopy does actually from 1 times up to over 1 million times magnification. So we're going to talk about the optical microscopes. So optical microscopes can really be broken down into 2 categories. What you call a stereoscopic microscope and a compound microscope. And the one that is most commonly used in your applications is the compound microscope. So the 3 microscopes that I have here, the ones on the end, the left and the right side, those are your classic compound microscopes. And the one in the middle is a stereoscopic microscope. The best way to describe, where you would use one or the other is that a stereo microscope, the one in the middle, is let's call it a glorified magnifying glass. You'll see what I've put there is ordinary salt crystals in the middle one. And it's actually quite interesting to go there and have a look at it, and you get the view of it. And the word stereoscopic, stereo, we know from our radios, is you get two views. So you get a 3-dimensional image. The classic compound microscope, everything that you see is flat. You don't get that 3rd dimension. You don't see height. There are optical techniques, we're not going to get into it, where you can enhance that, but effectively, one looks at a flat sample, and one looks at a sample 3-dimensionally. The other thing I must add is that the stereoscopic microscope has a limit to the magnification. So you can't really go beyond 50 times magnification, whereas the other one can go up to 1,000 times. So that just gives you a little bit of an idea. So if we concentrate on the compound microscopes, which is the area of interest for you folk, there's lots of lighting techniques, and lighting techniques are basically a way to describe a technique in order to see what you want to see. So the most common one is bright field. So this is where you have just a sample and you see it, let's say, in its natural state. So just with ordinary light that comes from the globe. Opposite to bright field, you have what they call dark field illumination. And what you're doing in dark field is you are not looking at the light directly from the sample, but you're looking at light that is reflected at an angle. And the best way to describe it is that if I'm looking at a sample and I put a torch at the bottom, or if I look at this piece of paper and I put a torch at the bottom, the black writing shines up and I can see it. In dark field, what you do is you actually light from an angle, from the side. So you don't look at the light coming through the sample, you look at a light coming at an angle. And what that does is it catches the edges of the sample and you get a different view. Where this is useful is that some samples are transparent and you don't get much information looking at them just in bright field, whereas dark field you get an interesting, let's say you get an interesting observation technique. The third one, which I have brought along here on the big microscope on the end, is something called phase contrast. And The advantage with phase contrast is that you can generally look at live cells, which you might not be able to see under bright field, because what you commonly have to do with bright field is you need to stain the sample with some kind of chemical medium in order to enhance the contrast. So you'll have different chemical stains that will actually attach themselves to the sample, and what you're actually seeing when you see the sample is you're seeing where the chemical stain has attached itself. And of course these are also in different colors, and you can get the information that you need from this. With phase contrast, it allows you to see the sample without having to stain it. So the sample can still be alive and moving, which if you look at under bright field, you'll see nothing. It'll just be white. And there'll be something very vague, but you won't be able to see it. And if you increase the light intensity, you get white out. You just basically get so bright, your eye pupil contracts in order to compensate for that, and actually you see nothing. With phase contrast, you're looking at what they call a phase shift in the light, and you actually see the sample. You'll actually be able to define it without having to go through the process of staining. So it's a good technique. And these are generally bright field, dark field, and phase. These are very common on microscopes. So what I've thought would be good to talk about is the three microscopes that I've brought here, just to give you an idea of the price difference in microscopes. So the one that is closest to me on this side with a single eyepiece with a monocular, that one sells for about 2,500 Rand. The one on the far end is actually a middle of the range microscope. It sells for about 100,000 Rand. Where do they start? Well, they start at a lot lower than 2,500 for really simple microscopes. And the top end optical microscopes, we have some systems in the country, they're over 2 million Rand for a microscope. Now obviously it's horses for courses, it's not going to be useful to you. You're not going to see more. It all depends what you're looking at as to, how much money to spend. But as a rule, looking at your sort of applications here, as a rule, you should be able to spend less than 10,000 Rand on a microscope, and you'll have a good basic microscope that will allow you to do whatever you need to do. The next thing is, nowadays, everybody is emailing everybody, and a common application that has become widespread worldwide in medicine is what they call telemedicine, where you basically take a blood sample, you put it under a microscope, and you send the image to somebody who's sitting in a different country. And you can do the same thing with your kind of samples. You can send that image to somebody and let them have a look at it. So maybe, if you had a basic setup, you could get something that, you're concerned about, and you could send the image, for example, to Kevin, and then he could have a look at it and he could tell you what it is or whatever. So that comes into the sort of the photographic side. So today it's digital cameras, okay? And again, for a decent application to be able to see what you need to see, you should be able to spend less than 10,000 Rand on a digital camera. So for 20,000 Rand, 10,000 Rand for the microscope, 10,000 Rand for the camera, you would have a more than sufficient system, to be able to work with. There's a lot simpler systems around, that are adequate for what you need. So again, it's how much you pay, how much. We were just talking now about resolution. Obviously, the higher the resolution is, it's like anything. The more information you see, obviously, the more the camera, etc., costs. But as a rule, you should be able to get away with something between 2,500 and 10,000 Rand as a good price for a camera. So, just talking about, we were having a chat about resolution of cameras. So nowadays, the cameras, let's say the race on the resolution has slowed down a bit. 10, 15 years ago, every 2 months, the resolution basically doubled, and people were getting better and better at it. Today, that's calmed down because we've reached basically the limit of what we can practically, or what we practically need. So, a basic camera today is about 1 megapixel, so 1 million dots of information on the image that you see typically on your computer screen or on a LCD screen that fits on the microscope. And they go right up. I mean, there's cameras of 70 megapixels. Now, I thought I would talk about that a little bit. Very often people think the more pixels you have, the better the image is. The truth is your screen has a limit, it has a resolution itself. So if you have a screen which has, for argument's sake, a 1 megapixel resolution, and you have a 50 megapixel camera, you do not see the image any better than if you took it with a 1 megapixel camera. In other applications, besides microscopy, so I'm talking about taking photos of scenery and things like that, it makes more sense to have higher resolution. It's worth spending the money, let's say, on a higher resolution camera. In microscopy, I often think it's a waste to have a higher resolution camera. And the reason is you can just simply swing an objective and you can go from a 10 times magnification to a 20 times. So on the microscope, without spending more money, you can double the size of the image you're looking at without actually having bought a camera that gives you better resolution. If you're still not happy at 20, you can swing it to 40. That doubles it again. And with most microscopes, all the two that I have here, you swing it one more time and you go to 100 times magnification. Yes, you get to a point and there's reasons for it that you can't see anything. So that's kind of your the rule. It's not strictly speaking true because there's other factors that come into it to do with the ability of the individual devices on the chip to actually resolve and to give color. So the rule is normally the cheaper the camera is, the worse the color reproduction is, and therefore generally the worse the image is. And obviously if you spend more money, you get a better and better image. But there's a crossover point where that doesn't apply, because what happens is that the devices become so small that their color reproducibility drops. So statistically, when you buy the camera, it says it's a 10 megapixel camera, and we have it often. People will contact us and they'll say, I had a 5 megapixel camera, or normally I had a 2 megapixel camera, and I paid, many years ago, I paid 30,000 Rand for it, and I thought I would upgrade it, and I got a 10 megapixel camera today, and the images are worse than the images I used to see on the old camera. And what it is it's just a statistic that people are pushing out, that it's got 10 megapixel. Yes, it has 10 million dots of information, but they're not great quality. So the quality of the chip is important. And there's only a handful of chip manufacturers in the world. And what you will generally find is the better quality microscope manufacturers, the better quality camera manufacturers buy the A-grade chips, and the guys who are looking to do cheaper products will buy the B and C and D grade chips. So one must just be careful of that. So again, as a rule, it's like everything in life, but it doesn't strictly apply. Normally, if you pay a little bit more, you get a little bit of a better quality camera. But with a microscope, don't get caught into this race for higher and higher resolution. The other practical consideration is, if I email you a 30 megabit image, your computer, first of all, you use up all your data downloading it, and a lot of your service provider will actually block that because it's just this massive image coming through, massive amount of information. So the practical way to look at it is most screen resolution is when I talk about screens, I'm talking about computer screens. The resolution is in the 0.7 to 2 megapixels. The image you see is normally an image within a screen with a whole lot of controls around it, where you're controlling the light and you're doing things. So your image within your screen is normally smaller than that. So my suggestion is, don't go crazy. 5 megapixel is more than enough. And it's our most popular camera that we sell is a 5 megapixel. We do up to 70 megapixels. But generally we tell people stick to that and rather use optical magnification, which is meaningful. If you magnify a digital image, all you're doing is you're making that pixel bigger. And that's where you get pixelation, where you start seeing this sort of like, starts looking like a puzzle. The rule is use optical magnification rather buy a better quality microscope and be able to see a better quality image. I mentioned the emailing of images. We spoke about that. It's practically you want to send something that is a few 1 or 2 megs, not more. So adjust your microscope accordingly. The next thing I wanted to talk about was quite common, and I think, Kevin, you have one of those dedicated digital microscopes. So they become very popular, and they have an advantage. They're quite cheap. So by dedicated, I mean that compared to these, which are traditional microscopes, instead of having the head here with an eyepiece that you look through, you just have a camera mounted here and you have a screen on it. So these are quite common. There's nothing wrong with them. They work well. The only disadvantage that I see with them is if something breaks on that microscope, you cannot repair it. And it's not that it's not repairable, it's just that that manufacturer that buys that screen buys it now. In a year's time, whoever they bought it from or whatever, the technology has moved so quickly that that one is no longer available. The argument you can have is that maybe, well, I'll just buy a new one. I saved money, I might as well buy a new one. The advantage of buying a system like the one on the end, where you have what they call a trinocular head, where you mount the camera, is you buy a decent microscope, and whenever you need to upgrade the camera, you just remove that and you put a new camera on and you have the latest technology. The microscope itself, the reality with microscopes is that in the past 30 years, actually more, in the past 50 years, nothing has changed. If you look at a microscope from 50 years ago and you look at a microscope today, I shouldn't say nothing, very little has changed. They've maybe become 10% better. But all the evolution in the microscope was from the last century, the turn of this century, probably up to the 50s. From the 50s and 60s onwards, we'd reached the limit of what you can do optically with a microscope. So I often say to people, if you've got a very good quality microscope, keep it. And especially, people buy these old Leica and Zeiss and old Nikon microscopes. Those are optically far better than a lot of the cheap products that you buy today. Rather get a good camera and put it on an old microscope. You'll actually get a better quality image in a lot of cases. So I think that's microscopes in a nutshell. I don't know if there's any questions. Nothing?
Alex, I'm going to stand next to you with a microphone.
Okay.
What I have found, if you'll bear with me, on my experience with the microscopes, is that a lot of times you would find that you would take a scrape of a fish and you would look under the microscope and you don't see anything. But there is something. Now what happens is that whenever, it's like you and I, when we're getting flu symptoms, we've got mucus, we've got a runny nose, we're sneezing and coughing, or we've got a sore throat. Now how does a fish defend itself? That is the first line of defense, is the mucus. So now what's happening? It knows that it's got parasites on, so more mucus. And what happens is those parasites are just beautifully tucking themselves in, especially when you see an ulcerated area with a scale, an old scale. How would you know it's old scale? You'd physically see it, or if you feel the scale, you'd feel a roughness. It's not a live scale anymore. It's nicely under that roof tile, as I always say, where it's hiding. So what I'm talking about is, what you do is, if there's heavy mucus, you divide that into a quarter, and then what you would do is you would spread that as best you can on the slide itself before you have the cover slide over. What you would do then is a drop of water, or even 2 drops of water, small drops of water. Leave it for 5 minutes, because now what's happening is the parasite doesn't know what's going on. It then starts swimming out of the mucus, under the mucus, and starts swimming into the water, and that's when you can detect it. And always a good idea, if you see something not right there, do 2 or 3 microscope scrapes. I promise you, it is, you'll be amazed what you can pick up sometimes, what you thought you saw on the first one and what you see on the third or the second one. So it's just always good to have a second opinion.
How long does a parasite stay alive in that, under the slide? Should you prepare or before you do that? Because sometimes I see nothing. I don't know, aren't there any parasites, or is it my fault?
Just make sure that if you're in direct sunlight with that slide, it dries very quickly. Then you're going to see nothing. So just make sure that your microscope is in, the slide at least, is in a shady area.
After half an hour?
Half an hour, I would not leave it for longer than 10 minutes. I wouldn't leave it for longer than 10 minutes.
Yeah, the trick always is to, if you want to analyze something live, is to keep the environment as close to the environment that it was in before. So they're quite expensive, but you get special slides that have almost like a, looks almost like a, what do you call it, like a farm dam. It's got a little wall. It's a cavity, that's right. Yeah. So what happens is that you can, and the things you've got to look at is light, temperature, and then the you know, the evaporation. Because the minute you start changing the environment, you know, there's no telling, you know, I'm not an expert on the different bacteria and parasites that you look at, but some of them are very sensitive to that. So small variations in temperature. So a good example is, don't, you know, for argument's sake, have a slide that's been sitting, you know, in the sun and is hot, and then you put a drop on there because you're almost cooking the sample. So now when you look at the sample, you don't know, is that, you know, just a dirt, or is it something that's died? You know, so you've got to just be careful of that. So try and keep the environment as close to what it was before. Okay. Yeah. All right. And yeah, if any of you would like to, you know, I'm here later on, or you can just, when you see me around, if you've got any questions, please come and ask. You know, we do a lot of the things that you need, for example, the slides and the cover slips and all of those, because they go hand in hand. And, you know, give us a shout. And then the products that we sell there. So I didn't mention that. If I can just quickly mention, we have Motic, which is a Chinese product, which we bring in really for the entry level. It's good value for money. I've been selling the Motic product now for 15 years, started in 2004 with it. It's a very good product. The other product is Nikon. That's on the very, very high end. You know, so if you go into all of the research organizations in South Africa, the universities, you know, the high end side of it, Nikon is the product. If you look in South Africa, the IVF clinics, 90% of them use Nikon, because Nikon was the original, the first test tube baby was made using a Nikon microscope. So I think it's something that, you know, these doctors want to do. They want to do it on the original product, which is good for us. So we do a lot of that in South Africa and in the rest of Africa. So just, you know, different products. So please come and ask me if you've got anything that you want to know. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.